Chapter 20 Virtue and Vice Economics, Part 5. How do we grapple with the power that incentives and markets have on our ability to find and afford the good things we desire and stay away from the things that might ruin us? How do we fight for a better quality of life when it's so easy to resign? How can we combat the constant demands on our attention that keep so many of us glued to screens? Do we even want to? Economic incentives can have a major impact on how people live their lives. The ease of access to student loans is one example. Welfare is another. Currently, our federal and state governments provide various forms of assistance to unwed mothers. This is certainly born out of a charitable instinct, and such charitable instincts kick in to keep representatives supporting such efforts. But when assistance becomes incentive, it can lead to abuse and a perpetuation of the status quo. George Gilder studied the effect of welfare programs on communities. Whole cultures have been incentivized to resist marriage, higher education, entrepreneurship, saving and investing money due to these policies. Single mothers are incentivized to have many children as the benefits increase with each dependent, but each one is culturally impoverished. The men are now incentivized to leave that community or hang around its fringes, engaging in criminal behavior. This leads children to be raised without fathers. The young girls follow the example they grew up with, becoming unwed mothers dependent on state support, while the boys are left without a suitable role model for how to become a man. This leads to high levels of incarceration and drug abuse. Drugs are another example. The prohibition against drugs drives prices on the illegal market, once led to a perception of high value, in which in turn incentivized people to become drug dealers, as it was a high income job with a low barrier of entry. The illegality of the drug trade created other opportunities to make money through various other forms of violent and organized crime, as well as petty theft and prostitution fueled by drug addiction. But in a perverse twist of the truly blind nature of market economics, corporations have found ways to become even more successful by profiting off these vices. Crack and heroin are still illegal, but doctors can readily prescribe opioids to anyone with an excuse of pain. Pharmaceutical companies can create new patents on drugs by slightly altering their formulation and incentivize the doctors to promote their distribution. This has brought drug addiction out of the ghetto and into the suburbs. When higher income people ruin their financial well-being by becoming addicted to prescription pain pills, they now find that the forces of market economics have made illegal street drugs far more affordable, and by switching their drug of choice, they can maintain their lifestyle on a panhandler's budget. A deep dive into the economic benefits to pharmaceutical companies caused by pandemic fear and gender ideology would be too much to cover here, but it's not hard to determine who paid the price and who reaped the reward. Marketing and sexonomics. Perhaps the most devastating effect of our modern economy is its impact on human sexuality. The economics of sex have changed rapidly through the intersection of technology and free market incentives. While it must be acknowledged that much of the changes in this area are due to changing philosophical and ideological opinions on the nature of sex and human sexuality, those areas have all actually been much more well covered than the corresponding influence of economic and technological change. The levers of economic control are not magical. They can't force people to value or pay for something totally worthless. A subsidy on useless widgets might move a few more units, but the effect is temporary. No such manipulation is needed to sell sex. There is a perpetual market for sex-related goods and services. This is, of course, because sex is a natural part of our humanity. It's the through line that connects us from the past to the future. As soon as we have the basic conditions of survival under control, the forces within our bodies drive us to find a partner. It's the next step in the process of building civilization. Ever since the prohibitions against adultery and coveting our neighbor's wife first captivated our rebellious imaginations, the desire to be free of oppressive morality has fueled the philosophical and scientific endeavors. The clear path towards this goal was realized by the philosophers of the 18th century, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who penned The Social Contract. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The opening line summarizes the emotional fervor of his worldview. The philosophical work sought to dismantle what Rousseau saw as the artificially constructed chains of society, to allow the noble savage to come forth. But what came forth was a creature without any noble aspects. Though he was brilliant in his intellect, it was an undeniably evil thinker who took advantage of the loosening of society's chains. One man understood the logical conclusion of the deification of nature, the Marquis de Sade. If nature is all, then what is right, and nothing more can be said. As nature has made us, the men, the strongest, we can do with her, the woman, whatever we please. The inevitable result was his cruelty to women. The Marquis de Sade shed all inhibitions. In his view, what was right was only limited by what was possible. His lasting contribution to 21st century culture is sadism, the practice of inflicting pain on others to receive sexual gratification, something which children are routinely taught about in public schools. Of course, this visionary prophet was too radical for his day, and his sexual crimes against persons of both sexes landed him in prison. But as his absolutely ungodly works of sexually explicit filth were passed around beneath the tables of high society, the worldview disseminated in bits of dialogue between the pornographic scenes lit the fires of the imagination in the next generation of thinkers. The true division in society lay not between friends and enemies of the people, but between those who were naturally masters and those who were naturally slaves. Only when this was appreciated and acted upon would the taint of Christianity finally be eradicated and humanity live as nature prescribed. The inferior class of man, so a philosopher in The New Justine coolly observed, is simply the species that stands next above the chimpanzee on the ladder, and the distance separating them is, if anything, less than between him and the individual belonging to the superior caste. From Tom Holland's Dominion. This worldview contributed not only to the Darwinian view of human development, but the economic and political theories of our current day elite, such as Klaus Schwab and Yuval Harari. The later streams are more visible in policies rooted in social Darwinism and the economic application of the survival of the fittest to competition in free markets. But it was Darwin's contribution that allowed for natural science to displace any belief in a divine authority. Eventually, Alfred Kinsey would use Darwin's theory to completely justify human depravity through a practice of extremely biased research. This was an important step in legitimizing the study of sex through the lens of Sade's sole criteria of what was possible. It also allowed expert sexologists into schools and policy rooms. This was much later, however, a culmination of the philosophical changes that had already been adopted by elites at the beginning of the 20th century. The philosophical change in attitude towards sex can be most simply summed up in the statement that sex has become morally neutral. A secular economy and secular government has no concept of sin, although it tries to create a system of protected rights and freedoms to determine how laws should be enforced. There is no clear distinction about whose rights and whose freedoms are most important when conflict occurs between parties, but market forces seem to protect the rights of those with the greatest ability to create wealth. Government should be acting in the interest of those who are unable to protect their own rights and interests, but for all the various reasons that corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency continually grow within these institutions, they usually end up colluding to protect the interests of the wealthy. The events downstream of this ideological shift, the invention of the birth control pill, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and the legalization of abortion, set the stage for economic and technological advancements to make massive profits off of sex. Since ancient times, governments have used propaganda to influence their citizens, but once they were combined with the theories and discoveries made in the fields of psychiatry and psychology, their effectiveness took off. This led to massive use of propaganda during the turn of the 20th century and into the First and Second World Wars. Madmen of advertising. At the same time, these same techniques began to form the new field of public relations, which led to a massive new field of advertising. Advertising campaigns gave corporations government-level control and influence on the economy. Since post-war Americans had very few unmet needs, the way to increase profit was to increase their desire for new products. A new type of marketer, called a consumption engineer, relied on the study of psychology to increase the demand for consumer goods. The goal was no longer about simply beefing up the bottom line, but to increase the numbers and individual debt burdens of consumers. People became the currency, even though it was still dollars changing hands. The measurable cause and effect of advertisement on sales and profit caused companies to gravitate towards the methods that worked. Rather than simply targeted ads to the demographic most interested in an item, they could expand their market by creating an alluring image of what life could be, and this was done through sex appeal. While we would not find these early post-PR advertisements the least bit lascivious, the change was drastic. Look at old newspapers from the 19th century, and you will see products being advertised. Drawings of stoves, suitcases, and sofas. If a model was involved, it was some kind of grandma who knew the difference between a good laundry gadget and a bad one. After the First World War, alongside the advent of cinema, there was a huge influx of beautiful faces. This not only had a profound effect on the sales of all kinds of things, but it created a glamorous new lifestyle for young people to aspire to. Modeling and acting were now open to anyone who had the desire to move to Manhattan or Hollywood. A large number of applicants fighting for a small number of positions necessitated finding creative ways to set oneself apart. Market pressure created a scenario where the gatekeepers would abuse their position of power for their own gratification on the casting couch. But when advertisers and film producers sought to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in their created media, they could always find someone willing to do what most girls would not to get ahead. Once borderline cases were accepted by the public through the introduction of sophisticated material such as Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine, there was no longer a way to enforce a technical distinction between art and obscenity. The blurry line was formalized as a result of the famous 1964 Supreme Court case Jacobellis versus Ohio, in which Justice Potter Stewart declared that the Constitution protected obscenity as a form of free speech, except in the case of hardcore pornography. However, he did not attempt to define such material, delivering the famous yet ambiguous statement, "I know it when I see it." However, as culture progressed, there was no clear way for the subjective judgment of an individual to hold back the changing tide. The thing that Potter Stewart could see, but not articulate, became invisible to a culture whose tastes for sexual imagery had been continuously expanded as a tool of economic growth. Society still had enough conscience about the need to protect children from adult materials, so prohibitions against exposing minors to nudity were still accepted and enforced. However, while pornography was kept in dark bags behind store counters and relegated to specific shops on the outskirts of towns, Children had ready access and exposure to materials and programming that escaped explicit labeling by threadbare inches of fabric. Shows like Baywatch created a narrative framework to facilitate stories about surgically enhanced models in swimwear, while other forms of media, such as the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, the Victoria's Secret catalog, and their televised advertisements and full length specials, simply celebrated the creation of clothing that could legally expose the most flesh, either through size or sheerness. Other shows, like Saved by the Bell, technically aimed at teens and tweens, but often watched by much younger children, would regularly feature storylines that allowed the adult actors and actresses who pretended to be high schoolers to appear shirtless or dressed in bikinis, while MTV provided lots of coverage of college students celebrating spring break in exotic locales, priming younger students with a ritual to look forward to. While primetime beer ads would regularly feature beach party scenes, young viewers would get more than a hint at what spring break was really about after 10, as advertisements for Girls Gone Wild would play at regular intervals. This was the moment when many long term investments came to fruition, as young men realized that the only thing separating them from the object of their desires was the amount of money in their bank account. At the same time, young women would realize that they were a valuable commodity and that the calculated exposure of their homegrown charms could place them in view of a national audience. This progression of the intensification and development of sexualized content in advertisement and entertainment only tells one half of the story of how economic forces can push vices and change the cultural landscape. Cartoons and cigarettes. To uncover the other half, we'll have to take a look at the history of advertising and marketing in another economically powerful vice, tobacco. A whole history is not needed here, although it is worth mentioning that Edward Bernays, a famous propagandist and the father of public relations, was perhaps best known for marketing cigarettes as torches of freedom, a campaign that encouraged women to adopt smoking as a symbol of feminine independence during the first wave of feminism in the early 20th century. Once women were enticed to begin smoking, the addictive nature of tobacco products helped them remain loyal customers. Over the course of the ensuing decades, tobacco producers would employ a variety of spurious claims about the benefits of smoking to women, such as a means of keeping off weight, something very important in the image-conscious world of the post-PR revolution, where a woman's sex appeal was one of her most valuable assets. Claims were by far of secondary importance to image in the sale of tobacco products. It was only through the visual mediums of film and photography that smoking could be portrayed as glamorous, by associating the casual use of tobacco with carefree and alluring women and various types of manly men, from the rugged cowboy to the sophisticated aristocrat. Other than Bernays' PR stunt, it's probably impossible to trace the first causes in the feedback loop of sex, cigarettes, alcohol, and image between Hollywood, the marketing and advertising firms, and the manufacturers of goods and services. Smoking became a lucrative part of the economy and provided enough excess resources to keep regulators and legislatures happy to look the other way. Eventually, once the wealthy and productive members of society began to age and suffer the effects of ill health, there was enough economic incentive to begin researching the long-term effects of smoking. The rise of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and the government's interest in bureaucratic oversight led to investigation and legislation against the harmful practices of the tobacco industry. There was no malevolent plot against the American people. Reduced lifespan meant a reduced period of consumption. The manufacturers would have been incentivized to promote healthy lifestyle choices if cigarettes were as harmless as long advertised. However, the toxic qualities of tobacco smoke are intrinsic to its efficacy. There is a direct correlation between the levels of toxicity in the product and its addictive qualities. When the practices of manufacturers were exposed, it was clear to see that economic forces pushed them towards increasing the toxic and addictive properties of their products to achieve higher profits and greater market shares. One of the biggest changes to the industry came in regard to methods of advertising. Cigarette companies had been using cartoons and cartoon characters to market their product to children long before they were able to normally use or purchase the products themselves. Characters like Joe Camel appealed to kids, perhaps for no simpler reason than when a kid turned 18, they might ask for Camels as the brand they knew best. Those days were fading out during my own youth, but Joe Camel remains an iconic image of my childhood. The final element is to trace the evolution of cartoons as a medium. Over the course of the latter half of the 20th century, cartoons gradually shifted from a medium of adult amusement, such as the early Tex Avery shorts, to primetime family programming like the Flintstones and the Jetsons, to a form of children's programming. Much of this last shift was due to the syndication of these earlier programs, where the episodes that once aired weekly were instead shown daily just as kids came home from school. These older cartoons, designed to be watched as a family, were seen as safe entertainment for kids, and along with the aforementioned Stone-Aged and Space-Age families, reruns of Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry would provide hours of afternoon entertainment for latchkey kids in typical dual-income homes. These rebroadcasts were funded by advertisements targeted directly to the kids watching, mainly selling toys. Unfortunately, the advertisers had no control over the content of this previously produced material, although some advertisers were clever enough to license these older characters, such as the producers of Fruity Pebbles and the Flintstones vitamins. These slightly higher premium was a small price for parents to silence the pleas of their whining children in the chaos of a noisy supermarket. This led the manufacturers of toys to begin creating their own cartoons. They would sometimes find intellectual property to turn into a franchise or otherwise create it from scratch, such as the case of He-Man, the protagonist of the show Masters of the Universe, in which the muscle-bound warrior would defeat seemingly endless throngs of unique enemies, each one designed to match their own corresponding action figure. This ultra-masculine character was designed with scientific precision to appeal to a 5-year-old boy with the addictive force of crack cocaine. The same psychological power of mythology that George Lucas had gleaned from Joseph Campbell to make Star Wars a massive success was now being harnessed directly to sell plastic action figures. He-Man, the toy, was in many ways a reaction to Barbie, but He-Man, the TV character, was an innovation. He-Man was perhaps the first, but far from the sole example of this phenomenon. A myriad of now familiar franchises had their first inception in the minds of toy designers long before their stories were ever written down. For every successful franchise, a half dozen flops were produced. Only the ones that immediately captivated the imaginations of young children survived. This narrowed the creative field into producing shows and products that fit a certain mold. The only way to gain a competitive advantage was to make the formula more extreme. This new form of narrative marketing created another innovation, as boys and girls responded to different stimuli. Whereas earlier programming might have been targeted towards children as a category, with some programs appealing more to boys and others to girls, by focusing on each sex separately, advertisers and toy producers could create far more captivating products and sell twice as many products to households with both boys and girls. Of course, one of the products that could be sold was the television itself. Once the production cost of televisions was reduced, a household could have more than one, and while the largest television set would still be centrally located, it became increasingly common for households to have multiple television sets, first in secondary dens and family rooms, and then in bedrooms. While my own family didn't have a lot of money, my brother and I were able to stay up watching Saturday Night Live on a portable black and white TV with a pink plastic case, indicating that it was really designed as a TV for girls. This manufacturing choice and the changes in programming and advertisement clearly indicated that marketers were assuming the audience would be unsupervised children, largely sorted by sex. Even if it wasn't true of the majority of viewers, it was true of those who would likely be the biggest spenders. If mommy and daddy were willing to let Junior have his own TV to watch unsupervised, they were probably willing to open up their wallets and shell out the cash for anything else he begged for. This separation of marketing towards boys and girls necessitated a focus on their distinctions at an earlier age. While prepubescent boys were mostly captivated by the masculine energy of He-Man and G.I. Joe, the narratives required the presence of She-Ra, Scarlet, and CoverGirl. The salience of these new cartoons was closely tied to their depictions of hypermasculinity, which required a contrasting portrayal of hyperfemininity. The older cartoons, those not originally created for children, would lampoon the characteristics of burlesque performances, usually by animals in drag. Jokes that would be obvious enough to the kids, but were really targeted towards adults. But the costumes and depictions of attraction and romantic encounters in the cartoons of the late 80s and early 90s would never have been deemed suitable for children if they had been portrayed by real actors. While the later PG-13 film adaptations of Marvel's X-Men portrayed the character of Mystique by an actress with a combination of latex scales and body paint, the animated depictions of characters like Rogue and Storm had unnaturally curvy physiques, whose outfits bore no resemblance to any fabric known to man. The only discernible indication they were clothed at all was the color used. These cartoons, while watched by children of both sexes, were skewed male and depicted male ideals of both masculine and feminine beauty. Yet at the same time, it also sold a more feminized version of imaginative play to young boys. The traditional toys boys gravitated towards were tools and weapons, guns and swords, whether bought from the store or crafted out of sticks through the imagination. These were the tools of embodied play, where the child became the cowboy or the warrior or the athlete, as sports replaced imaginative play into adolescence. The masculine energy that produced a desire for rough and tumble play would balk at the prospect of spending a whole day in front of the TV, at least when the only thing to watch was the children's programming of the 50s and 60s. The super salient imaging of the latter cartoons shaped the way a large portion of the later generations interacted with media. Playing with action figures was not truly so different from playing with dolls, with the exception that they were more likely to be destroyed in the process. In a reversal of this phenomenon, girls began to outgrow playing with dolls more quickly, as programming directed towards girls focused more on relational dynamics than action. It was the reality-based programming that became super salient for young girls. The aforementioned Saved by the Bell always appealed to young girls, while boys would only become intrigued as they grew closer to puberty. After the cartoon revolution that changed the way a generation of boys view the world, the advent of preteen dramas and comedies on Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel would begin to mold the future of their impressionable female audiences. The recent documentary series Quiet on Set revealed the most pernicious and abusive aspects of this form of media, which placed young children directly into the seedy culture that had developed out of the commodification of sexual imagery in film and advertising detailed above. The tragic consequences of the off-screen interactions between perverted adults and child actors is no small matter, but it was largely fueled by the glamorous presentation of the Hollywood lifestyle being marketed to younger and younger children. Even the grotesque portrayals of double entendres by naive children were symptomatic of the central effect of this programming. The central effect of this programming was the marketing of a lifestyle to young girls centered around their status, appearance, and ability to attract the attention of boys. Hannah Montana did not sell action figures, but clothes, makeup, and hair products. While the boys were extending childhood long into adolescence, the girls were growing up almost overnight. These trajectories reached a disastrous tipping point in the age of the internet. Young men had been primed to become consumers of pornographic material since the time they were kids, when all of a sudden all barriers were removed. Simultaneously, a generation of young girls who had idolized the glamorous lifestyle of models and actresses were now a highly sought-after commodity, if they were willing to go just a bit farther than their idols did. Once the mechanisms of internet commerce and advertising really began to materialize, the massive vacuum of demand collided with an enormous influx of supply, mediated by ambitious entrepreneurs whose moral compasses were solely directed by the growth of the free market. Over the last 20 plus years, various seedy underbellies have been exposed, but over the same time, the smart entrepreneurs have found the ways to profit not only from pornography, but prostitution in various forms. The ever-increasing demand fuels an increasingly lucrative system to attract new talent from girls, as social media became the new on-ramp and means of advertisement. It also drives illegal activity, as human trafficking statistics show that the modern sex industry has placed more people in slavery than at any other point in history. While it seems like these problems are too monumental to deal with, the logical place to start is at the central point of impact. What is the central point of impact? In the 21st century, the most common sex act involves a man in front of a screen and a woman in front of a camera. If this act ceases to drive economic growth, the powers of market economics will shift in other directions. But this means more than just convincing people to stop cold turkey. They need to be directed towards a better economic future. Long-term investment versus short-term gratification. The economic impact of free market economics and libertine attitudes towards sex have generated a lot of wealth for a lot of people. But this financial freight train has left a massive trail of bodies in its wake. The empowering feminist message of torches for freedom led to sexual slavery for the masses. In the metaphorical sense, for the men unable to peel their eyes off the screen, and tragically in the literal sense for many women, whether by financial dependence, chemical addiction, or physical captivity. Sadly, these poor investments will have long-term consequences that are not so easily reversed, even if the destructive behaviors fueling this crisis cease. The economist Thomas Sowell famously said, "There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs." What was traded to enjoy the economic benefits and hedonistic pleasures driven by sexualized advertisement was the greatest financial building block of every major civilization, the family. Look back at the chart of income and housing prices. The apparatus of advertisement and economics will supply you with endless reasons for why you should aim for the lifestyle of Boston or San Francisco. But marketers and advertisers only do what is in their best interest. Those few who struggle to rise past the economic hurdles and find some financial success will struggle even more to find a suitable long-term investment that can rival the rewards of marriage and family. The out-of-sync fantasies sold to young boys and girls are leading to enormous problems with successful people finding stable, long-term relationships and marriage partners. Women who profit off sex can rarely afford to have children, as pregnancy and child-rearing compromise the integrity of their physical asset. The prime years for childbearing are also the most profitable for producing adult content. Those who prioritize careers often sacrifice the same years to get ahead. The men who pursue career ambitions often do so looking forward to affording the sexual fantasies they have imagined since their youth, rather than pursuing marriage and family. The market cycle of the high income, high status lifestyle produces just as much real long term growth as the drunkard who spends his days lying in the ditch. Regardless of how much money one accrues, not $1 can be spent after death. Without intergenerational relationships, wealth, knowledge, and wisdom are all lost to history, or they are claimed by stragglers wandering by. Men are all chasing Aphrodite and finding they are lame Hephaestus, not Ares. Women who enjoy a season as Venus slowly transform into Echoes, pining for Narcissus or Artemis, the mother to no one. In contrast, the person who prioritizes marriage and family has a legacy that will continue as long as they can successfully transfer what they have to the next generation. It's not necessary to have children to pass on your legacy, but it is necessary to live in a community of meaningful relationships. The knowledge of how the pyramids were built has vanished from the earth, but each person living today represents an unbroken line of continuous survival, all the way back to our very first ancestors. Our existence cannot be credited to luck alone or genetic superiority. Although there are exceptions, the vast majority of our ancestors survived to pass on their genes through the context of a family within a community. When you read the Bible, you will notice from time to time the inclusion of a genealogy. These lists of ancestors were not something kept and remembered simply for the sake of tradition. They had an important function for survival. When two strangers met, they would share their genealogy, who their father was and their grandfather, up through the history of their clans and tribes. Eventually, they would come to a point of connection, as each of them descended from one of the 12 sons of Jacob. If they went to the land of Moab, Edom, or the deserts of Arabia, they would do the same, knowing that both their ancestors were one of the sons of Abraham. The bond of family, however far back, meant that one man could ask another for something to eat or drink, for clothing or shelter, and they would be welcomed in. In every human story, whether in conscious history or the ancient past, it's almost certain that a majority of those families were only able to survive because of the kindness and generosity of others. Someone made an investment with little or no chance of return. Yet those investments were paid back in kind to their children, grandchildren, or a future descendant with the same generosity. This generosity is not reserved for relatives alone, or for our own ethnic group, or the citizens of our nation, because when we trace these genealogies all the way back, we find that all humans are children created in the image of God the Father. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the case of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:17-19. This seems like a moral command, and in many ways it is, but it has an excellent long-term economic benefit for those who keep it. It instills a character of generosity that extends beyond our immediate families or communities. It's part of what once made America a shining city on a hill, and it's the practice that will restore the long-term health and prosperity of our community.